Hello, Data Standard community. I'm your host, Shana Weldon, and this is the Data Standard audio experience. We have a very exciting guest today. On our podcast, we have Anand Rao, the Global Artificial Intelligence Lead at PwC. He has over 32 years of experience in the industry, managing innovative artificial intelligence-based approaches, and is the innovating lead for the emerging technology group. Today, we are speaking about the commitment to responsible AI. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me to your show. Really great to be here with you.
I'm happy to have you here. Just please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm a partner at the PwC, and I'm also the Global Artificial Intelligence Lead for PwC. In addition, I'm also a leader in our AI and Emerging Technology group, which is now part of a newly formed group around PwC's Products and Technology business unit. I lead many of our cutting edge AI and emerging technology solutions for our clients, as well as over 60,000 of our professional services personnel, so both external facing as well as internal facing. I'm also one of the leaders in PwC's newly formed Trust Institute, again, very apt to the topic that we're discussing today on building trust in data, technology, and AI.
That is very impressive. So how did you first become involved in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been interested in computer science. Obviously, I grew up in India, and this was in the 70s. In my high school, I got very interested in computers technology, and it was still very much an emerging one then. Especially in India, there were just a few centers which had computing. And I started really programming without a computer, right? So you might wonder, how can you program without a computer? I had one of my cousins who was actually teaching me through letters. He was in London, he was working in the area. He started teaching me just to write code, and I wrote code without really executing the code. That's how I started. Maybe that was a good thing. I didn't have any bugs to look at, but I was just writing code. So that got me into computer science, and did my undergrad in India. And after that, I was sort of very keen on doing a PhD. I was looking at artificial intelligence at that point, mainly because that was a cutting edge, and that was one of obviously the most challenging problems. And I was just looking for something challenging to do. And luckily, I got a fellowship in Australia with the University of Sydney, and then went on to do my PhD there. So that's how I got into AI. And then once I did my PhD, so I've spent a year at TJ Watson Research Center. Then I joined a spin-off of SRI International, set up in a similar way in Australia. So, and then basically went on from there, working both for the DARPA, NASA, as well as a number of cool projects for the Australian defense as well. So that's how I got into AI. And for a while, I left AI. So when the AI winter set in the late 90s, I left AI, went into management consulting, one of the other areas where I went into strategy consulting. So spent at least a decade there, and didn't come back into AI until 2007-8 when the AI resurgence started. And so since then, I've been back in AI, but now this time more from a business side as opposed to an aerospace and defense side. So that's my journey in AI.
Got it. You just couldn't leave AI. Circled right back around.
Yeah.
So talking about AI, when we usually think of AI, I think we think of autonomous vehicles. But what are some other applications of AI?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So when AI gets mentioned, of course, there's all this Hollywood view of AI and AI taking over on one side. And also, we also hear quite a lot of things about autonomous vehicles, facial recognition, image recognition, natural language generation, all interesting applications, obviously very worthwhile applications. But what we have also done, obviously focused on these, but we have also focused on what we call as cool AI solutions for boring problems. So you might say, why does anyone want to work on boring problems? The reason why we are highlighting this boring is I think everyone doing data science wants to work on autonomous vehicles and cool deep learning. It's not that you have to use that only in AV or image recognition. You can use it in also mundane problems. So what I mean by mundane problems, invoice processing, right? So purchase orders, looking at documents, extracting pieces of information from regulatory documents. So these are all areas where today, if you look at the enterprises of today, we're literally spending trillions of dollars, I would say, in manual work, which can be easily alleviated by the AI that we have, right? So, and again, we are moving past the simple automation, or what is called as robotic process automation, into AI, machine learning, natural language processing. So you can still use some of the cool AI techniques. And we have done that in a number of different areas to automate tax processing. So again, for multiple states, for looking at extracting pieces of information from financial information from 10Ks and 10Qs, to look at regulatory documents and identify what are some of the requirements. So there's a whole host of things which are being done manually today, can be done with little bit of RPA, but more of AI, machine learning, and natural language processing. So just to give an example, we have done that for our clients, but also internally. And in one of our groups, we took literally 5 million hours out of people work and automated it using AI, out of a total of 15 million. Literally 1/3 of the tasks were automated away by the AI. And you can imagine the vast savings that would give, right? So in a firm like ours, and it's not just us, I think this can be replicated in a number of organizations, especially the large organizations where all of these things are done in a pretty much manual way. So we use some of the latest techniques. So we use deep learning, synthetic data, image recognition. So we do the OCR tools, but then build models for training very specific types of invoices, types of regulatory documents, and so on. So still many of the things that people use in the traditional deep learning, machine learning, we use them, but the problems are what we call as boring problems. So I think there's a lot of scope for improving the efficiency of these systems.
Got it. The boring problems really stuck with me. But also with AI, so how is it used for strategic decision making?
So I just talked about boring AI problems, right? So boring AI and the problems that AI can solve there. And it's not that we're just working on boring problems. So we're also working on some exciting problems. So the other end of the spectrum is more around strategic decision making. If you look at the number of use cases in AI, I know there are literally thousands of use cases now, right? So there's very specific sites just detailing all the use cases across different industry sectors, value chain, and so on. Almost all of them invariably tend to be very operational decisions where you're doing some kind of a diagnostics, or you're doing a prediction, you're doing forecasting, you're doing some recommendation, chatbots. So the number of those things essentially fall under very specific operational decision making, which is very fine to do. As I said, in the boring problem, that sort of comes in the next category. So manual work and then operational decisions are easier to use AI and automate and make it better as well. So not necessarily always automate, but make it more effective, right? So the answers might be better. But what we have also focused, we do quite a lot of that operational decision making using AI, but we have also picked up the challenge around strategic decision making, right? So we have seen very little of AI use in some of the more strategic problems. By strategic problems, I really mean, hey, we are introducing a new product to the market where there is no existing data set, right? So for example, autonomous vehicles. Yeah, there are some autonomous vehicles on the road here today, but if you're trying to set up a business, what is the business model that we should use for autonomous vehicles? And what type of autonomous vehicles? How do we need to go and gain adoption of those autonomous vehicles? So what are some of those issues around it? All that is very much the human domain, right? So again, it is strategic thinking. So strategy consultants or strategists sort of get involved in it. So we have been trying to get into that area, which tends to be obviously very complex problem solving areas, and how can we use AI? So the way we approach that is by a technique we call it gamifying strategy, right? So take a specific strategic problem, but convert it into a game and create an environment where you are trying to capture what are some of the environmental variables on which I, as a decision maker in an organization, don't have control of, and what are some of the things that I have a control around, right? So what are the strategic choices I can make, right? So I can make strategic choices around the technology. I can make strategic choices around the customer segments that I want to go after. I can make strategic choices around the pricing of my product, the service that I want to give. So these are all things that, if you like, an executive within an organization has control of, but they don't know exactly in what combinations they need to do this so that they can see increased market share, increased revenue, increased margins, and so on. So if you look at the game here, the game is you want to optimize market share, customer share of wallet, and all of those as your output metrics. And your input is, hey, what are some of the decisions that we have that we can make a change in terms of pricing or segments and so on. Then we build essentially an AI. So AI here is essentially agent-based models or digital twin technology. So I'll just pick up the example of autonomous vehicles again. So if you're looking for a business model for autonomous vehicle and saying, hey, what is the business demand for autonomous vehicles or robo taxis, if you like, in the city of New York? And obviously the demand there could be very different to Ann Arbor, Michigan, if you're trying to get in there, right? So now we model specifically these geographies, trying to look at where are people, where are businesses, when and how people go and commute today, and to what extent those things can be displaced by a robo-taxi. What is the right price point by which people will shift? What are some of the non-pricing issues that people might have around safety, around trust, right? So we can essentially encompass all of that, and we did do that within this particular strategic model. Then essentially run multiple scenarios based on the strategic choices, based on the customer adoption. Yes, there are a lot of unknowns, uncertain, but you can still model all of those. And now the executive, we call it a cockpit. So instead of looking at a dashboard, which is sort of backward looking, you're looking at a cockpit where the executive or the chief strategy officer is moving all these levers and saying, I want to enter New York. Maybe I have, 50 million investment. How many vehicles do I need? And what is the return I would get? What type of business model I should be running? So they can play around with all of those. And in some of these cases, we have 200,000 go-to-market scenarios. So something that you cannot imagine someone doing it on a spreadsheet. For example, 200,000 scenarios, pros and cons, and have the AI pick the most robust strategy and so on. So just to give you a flavor here, so we've applied this in the healthcare domain, financial services domain, auto domain, as I just mentioned. So there's a whole host of these things where AI can start really helping in the strategic decision making, not necessarily to replace humans, but essentially to sharpen our own intuition, right? So again, we go through and say, oh, we have worked in 30 years in this industry, so I have the intuition, but quite often the world is very different to when I started in AI. So I can't rely purely on my intuition, right? So you need to combine the data with the intuition and the AI to actually push forward and verify some of that or invalidate some of my assumptions. So that's what we try and do in the strategic decision-making side.
Wow. So combining data, intuition making, is that the word that you said?
That's right, yeah.
Intuition making and business models, we come to the idea of best management practices. So can you please elaborate on responsible AI regarding fairness, bias, and policy making?
Yeah, no, very good question. So that's something that very close to my heart. And again, as said earlier, I've been in the industry for 30 years and I've seen things go up and down, right? So people usually call AI winters, and I've been through one of those AI winters, and there is a lot of hype around that, right? So, and again, one of the things that I'm very passionate about is making sure that we are portraying AI and understanding not only the value that AI can bring in, but also the risks that some of the AI poses. Again, the technology itself is neutral. It's more how people use the technology either for good or for maybe more malicious purposes, or maybe just profit-making purposes, which may not be to the social good, right? So that's been an important area of work. which actually started coinciding with what PwC was doing around about 2016, when a number of our clients started asking us, hey, we understand data governance, we understand model validation for credit risk, market risk kind of models, but what is this, all this AI ML models? So what do we need to do there? What are some of the risks? How do we need to govern them? And that's the time when there was quite a lot of academic work that was coming through with what's called as FAT or FATE ML, right? So fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethical AI, right? So the 2014, 15, 16 was sort of one of the huge growth periods there. But when we looked at that academic work, there is quite a lot of detailed work that goes on into bias, into explainability, and so on. But for a corporate user, right, so for a data scientist sitting in a bank or in a healthcare company, there was literally hundreds of papers and maybe thousands of lines of code, tens of thousands of lines of code. And you don't know what exactly you should be doing. What is it that you are checking? So we basically got into not only understanding those ethical principles that various organizations were laying out, but then connecting it back to the practice, connecting back to the models that were doing some of those checking to come up with a responsible AI framework, a responsible AI toolkit, and also more importantly, a governance structure, the process and the governance that data science needs to go through. Not a wholesale change from what people are doing, but again, people are used to the software engineering life cycle, but data science brings its own challenges, right? So data, the models that use that data, and also the software in which some of these models are now getting embedded, all three are converging, and you need a combined process. You need a different process to be able to do that. And that's where we have spent some time to actually making some of these ethical principles more valid and more actionable, if you like, rather than saying, yes, explainability is always a great thing to do. Fairness is something that we should aspire to. But what does it really mean when I'm building a specific model, right? So there are 30 plus definitions of fairness. Now, it's a mathematical impossibility to have all of your algorithm meet all of those criteria, right? So your data set meet all of those criteria. So which ones do you choose? And how does a data scientist choose that? Or should a data scientist really choose that? Or should it be a business imperative? Right? So the business and the data scientist should get together, and what is that forum, and who is checking what is happening? So that's the kind of governance that we have given. So again, making it much more concrete. So again, pulling examples from other existing industries like financial services and so on. So really make it very tangible so that we can start taking some of the practices that the academics talk about, but then really bring it into the corporate world, which is where I think the rubber meets the road, with the AI essentially being used by corporates for consumers and for other businesses.
Wow, I can see why you're a leader in your field. So how do you manage a data science team, and what skills are needed, hard or soft skills?
Yeah, no, very good question. So data science, again, I know a number of people think of data scientists as, oh, they're just another type of programmers. They just sort of typically program in Python or R, right? So they just sort of, what's the big deal here, right? Is I know I've talked to many of the sort of the software or the technology people who think data science is just like yet another software. I think they can't be farther from the truth. I think there are very, very specific things that we look for in a data scientist. So for a data scientist, I would say there's sort of the 3 C's of data scientists, right? Again, being in the management consulting world, always come up with the 3 C's and the 6 S's and so on. So there are 3 C's for data scientists. So one is the curiosity, right? So I think first and foremost, we want the data scientists to be curious, both about the business problem and also about the technology or the way to address them, right? So there's so many techniques that are coming, literally tens or hundreds every day. So you need to be very much abreast with that and be very critical on, oh, this is an interesting technique, but where will I apply it? Or look at a problem and say, it's an interesting problem, not necessarily I apply the same technique that I've always applied for the past 10 years, right? So whether regression or decision tree, I'll apply it on this, right? So can we apply something different, right? So applying different methods. So I think that curiosity to be able to look at business problems, look at different techniques, and then trying out multiple of those, I think that's something that we expect all of our data scientists to have. The second part, sort of which flows from that curiosity, is you can be curious, but you also need to be creative, right? So you should be constantly experimenting with it, right? So just because this technique worked well, yes, you can definitely use that, and that should be the baseline, but you should be trying different other techniques, and you should expand the type of problems that you should be addressing. So just as I mentioned earlier around gamifying strategy, right? So this is something that we looked at all of the games around chess and Go and Jeopardy and said, those are all great, and there's some great techniques coming out of it, but they're not really impacting the business world. How do we take some of those same techniques, which are more constrained? Even Go, it's very constrained where there are two players, well-known rules. Yes, it is a difficult problem to solve, but in the business world, it tends to be even more complex, where the players are not clear, the number of the rules are not clear either, and in fact, the ones who win are the ones who change the rules and get others to play to their rules. How do you sort of handle that? So that kind of creativity is something that we expect, right? So to push the boundary. And the third one, I mean, you can be a great nerd sitting in a corner and coming up with all of these things. That doesn't really work in the business or the corporate world. You need to push yourself. You need to communicate all of the great things that you are doing, not from a technical perspective, but more from a business value perspective, right? So to your stakeholders on the business side. So you need to really be a communicator of the ideas and the results that your teams are coming up with, fully understanding them, but then communicating in the business language. So I would say curiosity, creativity, and communication are probably the three essential things for a data scientist. Now, we have also got into this notion of, hey, what does a manager do, right? It's a data science manager or AI manager do. And I would, obviously, they require these three, and I would add two more. So one is they need to be a coach and a guide, right? So we have a number of bright young data scientists sort of coming into the area. I know that's been one of the challenges, but now with the universities producing more data science curriculums and data and analytics curriculum, AI curriculum, there's a number of young folks coming out of universities, but they need to be coached and they need to be guided by experts or domain experts, as well as sort of data science experts. So we expect our managers to be really coach and guide, sit down, roll up their sleeves, and get into the problem solving mode, right? So as a result, they should have all of the attributes mentioned earlier, but they should also be good coaches as opposed to being lone contributors. They should basically be part of that team and the coach and the guide. And the other one I also talk about is collaborator, right? So again, data science is still very much in its infancy. AI is still in its infancy. There are a number of people who are very skeptical, and you need to work with them and to remove some of that skepticism, and to also be very honest, back to my discussion around the hype, not give in to the hype, but really say, hey, yes, we cannot solve that, but we can solve this instead, right? So essentially someone who can problem solve with the businesses together, a collaborator, right? So these are the 5 C's, I would say. So 3 that are curiosity, creativity, and communicator, and the coach and the collaborator as well added to that.
That was great. So we at the Data Standard are building a community for data enthusiasts and data thought leaders like you. And everyone here is open for collaboration and connection. So my question for you would be, what can our community do for you?
I'm very open to collaborating with other members within the community, right? So this could be in terms of thought leadership, podcasts, other training or educational material, right? So I think some of those things are very much needed. Again, I know we have a very interesting series of blogs. So again, very happy to collaborate with others. And also, I think for people who want to collaborate with me, you can also check in my Medium channel and my LinkedIn. I post quite a lot in my LinkedIn. So both those channels would be good places to at least know my interest areas and then find areas of collaboration.
All right. And then for more information on the Data Standard, you can find us at www.datastandard.io. This episode was sponsored by Pandio. They are innovating the tech space, and you can learn more about their work at pandio.com. But seriously, thank you again for joining us and giving us your time today.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.